So you do a lot of assessment in your facility. How can trainers be 100% sure of what it is they see during an assessment?
Well, that's a $1 million question there. If we can 100% sure, we'll probably be making $1 million or more. Uh, Leander, I suppose I'd be lying if I said, "Oh, I'm always sure." And I say at times I'm highly lucky. Through understanding movement, you start to see that seems to be whatever normal might be. You see the normal movement, and you know what the foot should be doing, what the hip should be doing, what the thoracic spine, lumbar spine should be doing at certain phases of gait. You can read all you want. We need to understand those, but then it's just a matter of practicing it.
Yeah.
After a while, you start to see certain tendencies in the same type of scenarios. Now, those tendencies, when I say tendencies, meaning, for instance, how the hip should move during movement. If you don't see that, it isn't to say, okay, this is what's going on with the hip. If you don't see that hip moving in a certain way, you can extrapolate what probably is going to be absent in normal, healthy gait. And then it almost follows an algorithm. And I wish I could say it's always consistently this way. However, there's many reasons why the hip may not move that way, and that's when you have to kind of sniff it out and see what's going on above and below the hip in this case. So I could have clients present with hip pain, let's say just hip flexor pain, and I could probably give you 4 or 5 different reasons off the top of my head why that could possibly be. So to say if I'm 100%, I wish I could say I was. But at the same time, if I know what the chain reaction should be and the hip is not functioning the way that it should, I know that there's going to be deficits, so to speak, above and below because of that chain reaction. I'll then look above and below. But either way, I still have to affect or create an intervention that's going to affect what's going on above and below. So if I'm not sure which it is, I hate to say it, but I'm just going to throw it all against the wall and see what sticks, because I know that if it is something below, it's going to have an impact not only through the hip but above. If I see that it's something above, it's not only going to have an impact in the hip, it's going to have an impact below. So there's, in the great majority of cases, you see where the limitation is.
And do you go from global to local movements? Do you try to narrow it down and see where the problem is?
The last place that I look is the site of the injury.
Okay.
I want to see what's going on, and you put it perfectly. I want to see what's going on globally first before I go in locally.
Yeah.
And I'll look at that through various movement patterns just by walking and by using arm drivers and change of body angles just to see how the hip in this case may be moving in 3 planes of motion and compare it to maybe the other side and how that moves in 3 planes of motion. Once I see where there might be a limitation, or at least I'm suspecting limitation through the assessment of just watching them walk first, again, experience has showed me, okay, here's a symptom, here's a characteristic of what I see, here's often what I see is the limitation. I'll go check that out. For instance, it may be a foot or ankle issue.
Yeah.
But then if I look locally at the foot and ankle and I see, hey, that's working pretty well, I've got to look elsewhere. So I'll take this global perspective first and then go locally to the regions above or around, but not to the site of the injury till the very last.
But the assessment is an ongoing process.
The assessment never stops.
Yeah.
You could present to me today and we do the assessment, but then if you're following up with me, many of the movement patterns that I've checked out with you during the assessment, I'm going to either have you do it again or I'm going to blend that into your training program and your corrective exercise strategy. So I'm always rechecking it.
Yeah.
I know you interviewed my friend and mentor Gary Gray, and as Gary has said, the exercise is the test.
The test is the exercise.
And it's very true. And when you think about that statement, not only is that a strategy or a philosophy that you could use for assessment, and of course use that for the program design. But when you really think about it, assessment doesn't have to be that complex. Mm-hmm. Yes, it is complex, but when you look at it, you don't necessarily have to know from at least a first glance that something is specifically incorrect, or when I say incorrect, something is specifically limited. Yeah. You know somebody presents with symptoms, and you know how at least movement should look. Yes, you got to study the biomechanical reaction through the body, but I think the fitness industry and the physio industry has at times convoluted things so much. I've got my thoughts of why that might be, but that's not relevant at the moment. Let's just try and make it simple. Let's look at what should be moving. If you understand what should be moving and how things should be moving in each region, and the way I try and look at things is what I call the big movement rocks. I want to see how the foot and ankle is working. I want to see how the hips are working and the thoracic spine is working. Those are the three big movement rocks that should have good mobility. And if they do, you're going to see that many of the sites of the common injuries are going to be telling you what to do. Because the number one injury that we see around the world that accounts for about $216 billion a year globally is back pain. In the U.S., it accounts for about $90 billion. So when you look at the back, it's stuck between the hip and the thoracic spine. But we can look at that and say, okay, that's what's going on there, but what's happening below? And that's where you have to look and see how the foot and the ankle complex are affecting the hips and the thoracic spine. So now you've gone from that local site, the back injury, and okay, we expand it to the hips and thoracic spine, but if I still see that there's a limitation, that's not telling me why. You present with back pain as an example. That's a what? Then I look at the hip may be limited in motion, or thoracic spine becomes limited in motion. That's still telling me what? I see that those are limited, but it's not telling me. The last question I ask, and the question I'm always repeating to myself, is why is that happening? Our industry does a great job of what, when, and how. What's wrong? You got back pain. What's going on? Well, the hip and the thoracic spine are limited in motion. They're tight. How are we going to affect it? Well, here's the program that we're going to do. Here's how we're going to do it. Here's when we're going to do this patterning, or here's when we're going to do the routine and the order that we do it. But we still haven't addressed the why. And I believe the fitness industry is getting better. It still is not anywhere close to where it should be to understand the whys. The physio industry is so-so with it. But once we start addressing the whys, that's going to have an impact on the what, when, and how. Because that's the problem, not the symptom. And assessment will, hopefully, I'd like to say, if I'm 90% accurate, I'd be fairly pleased with that. I strive for 100%. Sometimes I get lucky and I may not have hit what is exactly going on, but through the global movements, that's going to affect the local movements and people start feeling better. But the bottom line with this, the majority of injuries, the majority of overuse injuries is a limitation somewhere and a compensation elsewhere, and that compensation is typically the site of the injury.
Yeah.